The fire in the great hall had burned low by the time they brought Seraphine in. She had been asleep when they came for her. 2 enforcers knocked on her door just after 4 in the morning, their faces blank and unreadable, and told her the council was waiting. She dressed quickly, her hands calm even though something inside her chest already knew. She had felt the shift in the air that evening, the way people at the engagement dinner had looked at her, a half-second too long, and then looked away. She had told herself it was nerves. She had told herself a lot of things. The hall was cold. The stone floor pulled the warmth right out of her bare feet. 8 council members stood in a curved line near the far wall, and at the center of them stood Dorian Ashvale, the man she had loved since she was 16 years old. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he was looking at a point somewhere above her head. He would not look at her. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the elders, not the letter one of them held in their hands. Just the fact that Dorian, who had kissed her forehead that same evening and whispered that he was the luckiest man alive, would not meet her eyes. Elder Harwick read the charge aloud. Seraphine was accused of passing information to a rogue faction operating near the eastern border. The evidence was a letter bearing her name, her handwriting, directing the rogues to a gap in the patrol route. The council had found it in her quarters that afternoon. She listened to every word. When Harwick finished, she said clearly, "I did not write that letter." No one moved. No one spoke in her defense. She looked at the faces she had known her whole life, people who had eaten at her family's table and celebrated her name day, and watched her grow up, and she saw the decision already made in every single one of them. The verdict had been reached before she walked through the door. She looked at Dorian one more time. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. He still did not look at her. The banishment was declared at 4:47 in the morning. 2 young enforcers walked her to the tree line. One of them handed her a canvas bag without speaking. Inside was a change of clothes, a water canteen, and $40 folded in half. She took the bag. She did not say thank you. She walked into the dark between the trees, and the forest closed around her, and that was the end of the life she had known. She did not cry until she was far enough in that no one could hear her. Then she sat down on the cold ground and pressed her back against a pine tree and let herself fall apart, just for a little while, because she understood that if she was going to survive what came next, she needed to feel the full weight of it first. She cried for a long time, and then she stopped, and then she got up and kept walking. She found a town 3 states away, the kind of small city that does not ask too many questions of the people who pass through it. She rented a room above a laundromat from a landlord who was more interested in the first month's cash than in her last name. She found work at a diner on the main road, the early shift, 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. The work was hard, and the pay was modest, and she was grateful for both, because being tired left less space for the grief to fill. The first months were the hardest she had ever lived through, not because of the physical difficulty, though that was real enough, but because every time the diner went quiet in the mid-morning lull, or every time she lay down at night in her small bare room, she had to resist the pull of wondering why. Why had no one stood up? Why had the evidence been so perfectly placed? Why had Dorian looked at that point above her head instead of at her face? She thought about those questions until they stopped being wounds and started being something else. Puzzles, problems, and problems she had always been good at solving. She enrolled in night classes at the community college at the end of her 3rd month. Environmental law. It was a practical choice. She had grown up in pack territory and understood land and borders better than most, and she had always been sharp with paperwork and language, and the specific kind of argument that did not rely on volume to win. Her professors noticed quickly that she was not an ordinary student. She was not taking notes to pass a test. She was taking notes because she intended to use every single word. She met Marcus Webb at the gym on the edge of town during her 5th month. He was a retired boxer, 60 years old and still built like someone who had never stopped working, and he watched her use the heavy bag one evening with the focused attention of a man who has spent a lifetime learning to recognize serious intent. He offered to train her. She said yes without hesitation. She trained before her diner shift and after her classes, and on her 1 day off each week. Marcus pushed her hard, and she pushed herself harder, and somewhere in the sweat and the early mornings, and the burning muscles, she found something she had not expected to find. Not anger, not revenge, just a very quiet, very steady sense of herself. She began to understand what she was made of, in the way a person only can when everything else has been stripped away. In her second year, she started to investigate the letter. She was careful and patient. She called in small favors from people she had known on the edges of pack society, people who owed her nothing but chose to help anyway because she asked honestly and never pretended the risk was smaller than it was. She followed paper trails and tracked patrol schedules and cross-referenced dates until the picture became impossible to misread. Cassian Vale had forged the letter. Dorian's cousin, the pack's head enforcer, a man Seraphine had always found too smooth and too pleased with himself. His reason was not complicated. There was a woman from a northern family whose people controlled water rights to 3 territories, and a marriage between that family and the Ashvale line would bring the pack significant power. Seraphine was in the way. Cassian had decided to remove her. It had taken him an afternoon. She sat with that information for a long time. She did not act on it right away. She was learning, in those years, the difference between reacting and choosing, and she was learning to choose. She began to meet other wolves, not looking for them exactly, but not turning them away either. They came to her in the way lost things sometimes find their way to someone who has also been lost and come through it. A woman named Dara showed up at her door one winter evening, 26 years old, banished from her own pack at 19 for asking too many questions about how the leadership spent the community's shared resources. A man named Soren, who had been exiled after refusing to follow an order he knew was wrong. Others after them, each one carrying their own version of the same story, thrown away by the people who were supposed to be their family. Seraphine did not make them promises. She offered them something more reliable. She offered them structure and honesty, and the use of everything she had learned about land law and legal documentation, and how to build something that could not be easily taken apart by someone with a grudge and a forged letter. She called what they were building the Nocturne Accord. It was not a pack in the traditional sense. There was no single dominant authority demanding obedience through fear. It ran on trust and contribution, and the radical idea that a person who had been thrown away was still a person worth something. Seraphine led it not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it, slowly and genuinely, in the way that real authority is always earned, through showing up and doing the hard thing, and never asking anyone to take a risk she was not willing to take herself. By her 5th year out of Ironmore, the Nocturne Accord held legal title to land in 3 states. Seraphine had argued 2 significant cases in human courts protecting their territories under environmental statute, and won both of them. The community had a clinic, a small school, a council of its own that actually listened to the people in it. Wolves who had arrived with nothing but exhaustion and old wounds had built homes and found their footing, and started to believe that the story did not have to end the way it had begun. Word traveled, as it always does in the world she came from. Her name moved through the whisper networks and border patrol reports, and quiet conversations at council gatherings. The alphas of the established packs began to pay attention, not warmly, but with the careful attention that powerful people give to something they cannot quite categorize. She was 30 years old when the Regional Land Council convened in the Eastern Corridor. 3 states, 7 packs, 1 newly recognized independent community, all with stakes in the same stretch of forest. Seraphine attended as the head of the Nocturne Accord. She arrived last. She had learned that patience was its own kind of statement. The room went quiet when she walked in. She felt it the way you feel weather changing, something in the air pressure shifting, and she did not slow down or look around for approval. She took her seat at the council table and opened the folder in front of her and got to work. Dorian was across the table. She had known he would be there. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything now, by sitting with the feeling until it was manageable, and then deciding how she intended to behave before she walked into the room. She gave him a single nod across the table. Polite, professional, one peer acknowledging another. He looked older than she remembered. His expression when he saw her was something she did not let herself read too carefully, because that was not what she was there for. Cassian Vale made his mistake midway through the morning session. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he held his pen too tight and shifted in his chair. When the question of the Nocturne Accord's territorial standing came to the floor, he challenged it directly, questioning whether a community without a recognized alpha had legal standing at the table, implying, without quite stating it, that Seraphine's history was relevant to her credibility. He was still speaking when Seraphine opened the second folder she had brought. She placed a copy of the forged letter in the center of the table. Beside it, she placed 6 years of documented evidence. The paper trail she had followed carefully and patiently and without rushing, because she had understood from the beginning that the work mattered more than the timing. She laid it all out clearly and calmly in the language of the council, no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just the facts arranged in the order they had happened and the conclusions they inevitably led to. The room was very quiet when she finished. Cassian left the meeting under escort before the morning session ended. The council voted to table his challenge to the Nocturne Accord's standing, pending a full review of the evidence she had provided. It was not a complete victory. She had not expected one. She had expected exactly this: a beginning, a crack in the wall, the first real consequence finding the person who had earned it. Dorian found her in the corridor during the midday break. He said her name the way a person says a name they have carried alone for a long time. She stopped. She turned to face him. She gave him that. He wanted to explain. He told her he had not known about Cassian, not until much later, and by then he had told himself so many versions of the story that he was not sure anymore what he had believed at the time, and what he had simply let himself believe, because it was easier. He told her he had looked for her. She did not ask whether that was true. He wanted to apologize. She listened to the whole apology. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she said, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I spent too long carrying something that belongs to you, and I am done with that." He started to say something else. She could see it in his face, the reaching toward something, the hope that forgiveness meant a door opening rather than closing. She said it gently, but without leaving any room for misunderstanding. "There is nothing left to come back to, Dorian. I do not need what was taken from me. I built something better." She returned to her seat at the council table. The afternoon session continued. When the meeting ended, she walked out of the building with Dara and Soren and her human attorney, and they drove back toward Nocturne territory, with the windows down and the late afternoon light cutting gold across the road. The morning after the council meeting, Seraphine stood at the eastern edge of her territory as the sun came up. The trees were tall and old, and the light moved through them slowly, turning everything a quiet gold. Dara stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing that needed saying right away. They had built this. The two of them and Soren and every other person who had arrived with nothing and chosen to stay and work and trust. They had built it out of $40 and a canvas bag and 6 years of early mornings and hard choices and the stubborn refusal to accept that being thrown away meant being worth nothing. The alphas of the Eastern Corridor would spend the next months figuring out what to do about the Nocturne Accord. They would meet in their own halls and weigh their options and try to find a lever. Seraphine knew this, and was not worried by it. She had documentation they could not challenge, and land they could not take, and people who would not be bought or frightened away, and she had learned something in 6 years that most of them had never had to learn. She had learned what she was capable of when there was nothing left to lose. She had found out that the answer was quite a lot. The sun finished rising over the pines. She had been sent into the dark before sunrise once, with $40 and someone else's verdict about what she was worth. She had walked out of that dark on her own 2 feet and built something real and lasting on the other side of it. Every alpha who had sat in that council room yesterday had watched her, and not one of them had stood up to challenge her, not because she had broken them, not because she had frightened them, but because she had simply and completely become someone it would be foolish to underestimate. She stood in the morning light on her own land and breathed in the cool air, and felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly like herself. She had not come back to take back what was taken. She had come back to show what becomes of a woman when you throw her into the dark and she decides, all on her own, to become the light.